Margaret Chen had lived in apartment 7B for 3 years, and her neighbors knew almost nothing about her. The residents of Sunset Gardens apartment complex in Colorado Springs saw her occasionally in the hallways, always dressed in simple clothes, carrying groceries or walking her small terrier named Scout. She was polite but distant, offering only brief nods and quiet hellos when their paths crossed. The building manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, often wondered about the quiet Asian woman who paid her rent 3 months in advance and never complained about anything. Margaret's apartment was directly above the community room, and sometimes residents heard classical music playing softly through the thin floors. No visitors ever came to see her, no delivery trucks stopped for her except for basic groceries, and her mailbox contained only bills and advertisements. What made Margaret particularly mysterious was her routine. Every morning at exactly 5:30, she would leave the building dressed in athletic wear and return 2 hours later, slightly out of breath but with a determined look in her eyes. The early risers in the building assumed she was just another fitness enthusiast, but there was something different about her movements, something precise and military-like in the way she carried herself. Her neighbor in 7A, retired teacher Helen Burke, had tried multiple times to strike up conversations with Margaret. Helen would mention the weather, ask about Scout, or comment on the beautiful piano music that sometimes drifted from Margaret's apartment. Margaret would respond politely but briefly, always seeming eager to end the conversation and retreat to her private world behind the door marked 7B. The other residents had created their own theories about Margaret. Some thought she might be a grieving widow. Others suspected she was hiding from someone or something. The college students on the second floor joked that she might be a spy, but they said it laughing, never imagining how close to the truth they actually were. Margaret's apartment was sparse but organized. The living room contained only essential furniture, a high-end computer setup that seemed out of place with her modest lifestyle, and several framed photographs turned face down on a bookshelf. The photographs remained hidden because they showed a different version of Margaret, one wearing a military uniform with wings pinned to her chest and standing beside some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. Every evening, Margaret would sit at her computer and monitor several radio frequencies, listening to chatter that most people would find incomprehensible. She had maintained this routine since moving to Colorado Springs, staying connected to a world she had left behind but could never truly escape. The F-22 Raptor base at nearby Peterson Air Force Base was always active, and Margaret found comfort in the familiar sounds of military communication, even though she was no longer part of that world. Scout would curl up beside her during these evening sessions, seeming to understand that this was important time for his owner. The little dog had been with Margaret through her transition from military life to civilian obscurity, and he was perhaps the only living being who truly knew the woman behind the quiet facade of apartment 7B. None of her neighbors could have guessed that the woman they saw carrying grocery bags and walking a small dog had once been one of the most skilled pilots in the United States Air Force. Margaret had flown missions that remained classified, had trained the next generation of F-22 pilots, and had earned respect from colleagues who considered her one of the best aviators they had ever worked with. But that life seemed like a distant memory now. Margaret had chosen to leave it all behind for reasons she kept locked away as securely as those face-down photographs. She had built a new identity as a quiet civilian, believing that her military past would remain buried forever in the classified files of the Air Force. As Margaret prepared for bed each night, she would look out her window toward the mountains and sometimes see the distant lights of aircraft taking off from Peterson Air Force Base. A part of her missed the feeling of pulling G-forces in a fighter jet, the precision required for aerial maneuvers and the camaraderie of her fellow pilots. But she had made her choice to live quietly in apartment 7B, and she was determined to stick with it. What Margaret didn't know was that very soon, her carefully constructed civilian life would be shattered by a radio transmission that would force her back into the world she had tried so hard to leave behind. The skills she had worked to forget would suddenly become the only thing standing between life and death for people she had never met, and the quiet lady in 7B would have to become the pilot she once was. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed for Margaret Chen. She was following her usual routine, returning from her morning workout when she heard the emergency sirens wailing across Colorado Springs. The sound made her stop dead in her tracks on the apartment building's front steps. Those weren't tornado warnings or fire department calls. Margaret recognized the pattern immediately. It was the base emergency alert system. Racing up to her apartment, Margaret quickly turned on her radio equipment and began scanning military frequencies. What she heard made her blood run cold. 2 F-22 Raptors had collided during a training exercise over the Rocky Mountains. One pilot had ejected safely and was being rescued, but the second aircraft was still airborne with an unconscious pilot inside. The radio chatter revealed a desperate situation. Captain Sarah Mitchell, callsign Phoenix, was trapped in a damaged F-22 that was losing altitude rapidly. The collision had damaged her ejection system, and she was unconscious from the impact, unable to respond to radio calls from the base. The aircraft was flying on autopilot, but its systems were failing one by one. Margaret listened as the rescue coordinators tried every possible solution. They had scrambled additional F-22s to escort the damaged aircraft, but the pilots couldn't get close enough to assess the situation properly. The mountains below offered no safe landing areas, and the aircraft was heading toward populated areas of Denver. Time was running out, and everyone on the frequency knew it. The radio crackled with updates every few minutes. "Phoenix is still unresponsive," came one transmission. "Aircraft altitude continuing to decrease," reported another. The base commander's voice cut through the chatter, asking for any pilot with experience in emergency F-22 procedures to report to the base immediately. But Margaret knew that the pilots currently available wouldn't have the specific knowledge needed for this situation. As she listened to the increasingly desperate communications, Margaret realized something that made her heart race. She recognized the voice of one of the escort pilots. It was Lieutenant Colonel James "Hawk" Harrison, her former wingman and one of the few people who knew about her classified work with experimental F-22 systems. If anyone would remember her expertise, it would be Hawk. Margaret had spent 2 years working on a top-secret project involving F-22 remote guidance systems. She had developed techniques for manually controlling damaged aircraft from the ground, procedures that were still classified and known to only a handful of people. The knowledge she possessed might be the only way to save Captain Mitchell's life, but using that knowledge would mean revealing who she really was. Margaret had left the Air Force under circumstances that made returning complicated. She had classified information in her head that wasn't supposed to exist outside secure military facilities. Getting involved would mean answering questions she had hoped never to face again. Scout sensed her distress and whined softly beside her chair. Margaret absently petted the dog while wrestling with an impossible decision. She could hear the fear in the voices on the radio as updates became more grim. The damaged F-22 was now less than 30 minutes from populated areas, and Captain Mitchell was still unconscious. Margaret stood up and walked to her bookshelf. With trembling hands, she turned over one of the face-down photographs. It showed her standing beside an F-22 Raptor, wearing her flight suit with the patch of the experimental test squadron. The woman in the photograph looked confident and determined, someone who would never hesitate to help a fellow pilot in danger. Looking at that photograph, Margaret knew what she had to do. She moved to her computer and began typing rapidly, accessing frequencies that she technically no longer had authorization to use. Her fingers remembered the encryption codes, and soon she was connected directly to the emergency command frequency at Peterson Air Force Base. The radio fell silent when Margaret transmitted her first message. Her voice was steady and professional as she identified herself using a call sign that hadn't been heard on military frequencies for 3 years. "Peterson Base, this is Reaper requesting immediate patch to emergency command. I have information relevant to Phoenix recovery operation." The silence stretched for several seconds before a familiar voice responded. "Reaper, this is Hawk. Confirm your identity and location." James Harrison couldn't believe what he was hearing. Margaret Reaper Chen was supposed to be retired and living somewhere under a new identity. Her sudden appearance on the emergency frequency was both shocking and potentially the answer to their prayers. Margaret took a deep breath before responding. She knew that her next words would change everything, that there would be no going back to the quiet life of apartment 7B. "Hawk, this is Reaper. I'm civilian now, but I'm monitoring your emergency. I have knowledge of F-22 remote guidance protocols that might help with Phoenix recovery. Request permission to assist." The excitement in Hawk's voice was obvious even through the radio static. "Reaper, thank God, get to the base immediately. We'll have clearance waiting for you at the gate." Margaret was already moving toward her closet, pulling out a bag she'd hoped never to use again. Inside were her old identification cards, clearance documents, and the technical manual she had kept despite regulations requiring their return. As Margaret prepared to leave apartment 7B for what might be the last time as an anonymous civilian, she could hear her neighbors in the hallway discussing the emergency sirens. Mrs. Rodriguez was asking if anyone knew what was happening, and Helen Burke was worried about a possible natural disaster. None of them could imagine that their quiet neighbor was about to attempt one of the most challenging aircraft rescues in military history. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she grabbed her keys and headed for the door. Scout followed her to the entrance, sensing something important was happening. She knelt down and scratched behind his ears, whispering, "Stay here, boy. I'll be back." But even as she said it, Margaret wasn't sure if that would be true. The drive to Peterson Air Force Base took only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Margaret's mind raced through the technical procedures she would need to remember. The remote guidance system she had helped develop was complex and had never been tested in a real emergency situation. If she made even one mistake, Captain Mitchell would die, and possibly innocent civilians on the ground as well. At the base gate, security personnel were waiting for her. Margaret showed her old identification, and within minutes she was being escorted to the emergency command center. The building looked exactly as she remembered it, but walking through those corridors again felt surreal after 3 years of civilian life. The command center was chaos when Margaret arrived. Dozens of personnel surrounded banks of monitors showing radar tracks, weather data, and live video feeds from the chase aircraft. The damaged F-22 appeared as a blinking dot on the main screen, steadily moving toward Denver while losing altitude. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison spotted Margaret immediately and rushed over. Hawk looked older than she remembered, with more gray in his hair and worry lines around his eyes. "Reaper, I can't believe you're here," he said, grasping her hand. "We're running out of options. Phoenix has been unconscious for 25 minutes, and we estimate 15 minutes before she reaches populated areas." Margaret looked at the tactical display and felt her old instincts kicking in. The damaged aircraft was flying at an altitude of 12,000 feet and descending at roughly 300 feet per minute. Its current heading would take it directly over suburban neighborhoods unless something changed quickly. "What's the status of the remote guidance systems?" Margaret asked, already moving toward the computer terminals she remembered so well. The technician manning the station looked confused by her question. Remote guidance was still classified, and most of the current personnel didn't even know it existed. Hawk quickly explained to the base commander who Margaret was and why her knowledge was crucial. Colonel Rodriguez, the base commander, made the decision to give Margaret full access to the classified systems. "Whatever you need, you've got it," he told her. "Just bring our pilot home." Margaret's fingers flew over the keyboard as she accessed systems she had helped design. The remote guidance protocol required establishing a secure connection with the damaged aircraft's computer systems, and then carefully overriding the autopilot to manually control the plane from the ground. It was incredibly dangerous because any mistake could cause the aircraft to crash immediately. The first challenge was establishing contact with the F-22 systems. The collision had damaged several communication arrays, and Margaret had to route the connection through backup systems. She worked frantically while listening to updates from the chase pilots who were still flying alongside the damaged aircraft. "Phoenix is still unresponsive," came the report from one of the escort pilots. "We can see movement in the cockpit, but she's definitely unconscious. The canopy appears to be cracked, and there's visible damage to the left engine nacelle." Margaret finally established a weak connection to the damaged aircraft's computer systems. Her screen filled with diagnostic data that painted a grim picture. The left engine was operating at only 60% power, the hydraulic systems were compromised, and the flight control computers were operating in degraded mode. "I've got a connection," Margaret announced to the command center, "but it's unstable. I'm going to attempt to level off the descent and turn away from populated areas." She began inputting commands, her training taking over despite the years away from these systems. The room fell silent as everyone watched the main tactical display. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft's descent rate began to decrease. Margaret had successfully taken control of the damaged F-22 from the ground, but the celebration was short-lived. The aircraft was still heading toward Denver, and Margaret needed to execute a turn without causing the damaged plane to stall or break apart. The escort pilots reported that the aircraft was responding to her commands, but they could see that the structural damage was worse than initially thought. "Reaper, you need to know something," Hawk said quietly, moving beside her workstation. "The ejection system isn't just damaged, it's completely non-functional. If you can't land this bird safely, Phoenix doesn't have any other options." Margaret felt the weight of that information settle on her shoulders. Captain Mitchell's life depended entirely on Margaret's ability to remotely fly a damaged aircraft that she couldn't see or feel. She had to rely completely on instrument data and reports from the chase pilots to guide her decisions. The aircraft was now turning away from Denver, but Margaret faced an even bigger challenge. She needed to find a place to land an F-22 with damaged engines and compromised flight controls, while keeping an unconscious pilot alive. The nearest suitable runway was back at Peterson Air Force Base, but getting there would require flying the damaged aircraft through mountain terrain in deteriorating weather conditions. Margaret looked at the weather radar and saw storm clouds building over the mountains. Time was running out, and she was about to attempt something that had never been done before: landing a fighter jet remotely while its pilot was unconscious. The quiet lady from apartment 7B was gone, replaced by Reaper, one of the most skilled pilots the Air Force had ever produced. Margaret's concentration was absolute as she guided the damaged F-22 through a series of gentle turns toward Peterson Air Force Base. Every few seconds, she checked multiple data streams: altitude, airspeed, engine performance, and structural stress indicators. The aircraft was holding together, but barely. "Reaper, this is Eagle 2, came the voice of one of the chase pilots. "I'm seeing fluid leaking from Phoenix's aircraft. Looks like hydraulic fluid, and it's getting worse." This was exactly what Margaret had feared. Without hydraulic pressure, the aircraft's control surfaces would become increasingly difficult to manage. The base had cleared all air traffic for 50 miles around Colorado Springs. Emergency crews were positioned along the runway, and medical teams stood ready to treat Captain Mitchell the moment the aircraft touched down. Margaret could feel the eyes of everyone in the command center, watching her every move. "Phoenix's vitals are stable," reported the flight surgeon who was monitoring the unconscious. "Pilot's medical telemetry. Heart rate elevated but steady, breathing regular. She's alive, but we need to get her on the ground soon. The stress of G-forces in cabin, pressure changes could be dangerous for someone who was unconscious." Margaret began the delicate process of reducing altitude for the approach to Peterson. The damaged aircraft responded sluggishly to her commands, and she had to make constant adjustments to keep it stable. The chase pilots provided running commentary on the aircraft's condition, reporting that the damage appeared to be worsening with each passing minute. "Reaper, be advised that Phoenix's canopy is showing stress fractures," reported Eagle 2. "If it fails, we'll have rapid decompression issues." Margaret acknowledged the warning while making mental calculations. A canopy failure would be catastrophic at their current altitude, but she couldn't descend too quickly without risking a complete loss of control. The weather was becoming a factor as well. Storm clouds were building over the mountains, and crosswinds were starting to affect the aircraft's flight path. Margaret had to constantly adjust her approach to compensate for wind gusts that she couldn't feel but had to anticipate based on weather data and reports from the chase pilots. 5 miles out, Margaret announced to the command center, "Beginning final approach sequence." This was the most dangerous part of the entire operation. Landing required precise control of airspeed, altitude, and aircraft attitude, all while managing an aircraft that was barely flyable. Colonel Rodriguez moved to stand behind Margaret's workstation. "The entire Air Force is watching this, Reaper," he said quietly. "But don't think about that. Just bring her home like you've done 1,000 times before." Margaret nodded without taking her eyes off the screens. The approach lights of Peterson Air Force Base appeared on Margaret's display as the chase pilots guided the damaged aircraft toward the runway. Every person on the base had stopped their normal duties to watch the emergency landing attempt. Margaret could hear radio chatter from fire trucks and ambulances positioning themselves along the runway. 2 miles out, Margaret called out, descending through 1,000 feet. The aircraft was shaking badly now, and the chase pilots reported that pieces of the damaged engine nacelle were starting to break away. Margaret had to land this aircraft soon, or it would break apart in the air. The most critical moment came as Margaret lined up the aircraft with the runway. The crosswinds were stronger than expected, and she had to make a last-second correction to keep the F-22 aligned with the center line. Through her computer interface, she could feel the aircraft fighting her commands, the damaged flight controls making every adjustment a struggle. "Half-mile out," she announced. "Chase aircraft, please confirm my alignment." Eagle 2 responded immediately. "Reaper, you're slightly left of center line, but looking good. Phoenix's aircraft is holding together." Margaret's hands moved rapidly over the controls as she began the final descent. The aircraft was now visible to people on the ground, and she could hear radio calls from the tower confirming that emergency crews were ready. Everything depended on the next 60 seconds. The damaged F-22 crossed the runway threshold at exactly the right altitude and airspeed. Margaret had compensated perfectly for the aircraft's limitations and the environmental conditions. But the hardest part was still ahead, actually touching down without losing control. "Touchdown in 10 seconds, Margaret announced. She could feel sweat running down her back, despite the air conditioning in the command center. Through the computer interface, she sensed the aircraft's wheels approaching the runway surface. The moment of contact was perfect. The main landing gear touched down smoothly, and Margaret immediately deployed the drag chute and applied brakes. The aircraft rolled down the runway under control, gradually slowing as emergency vehicles raced alongside it. "Phoenix is down! Phoenix is down!" shouted one of the chase pilots. "Perfect landing, Reaper. You did it." The command center erupted in cheers and applause, but Margaret remained focused on her screens until the aircraft came to a complete stop. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft within seconds. Medical personnel climbed onto the wing and began working to extract Captain Mitchell from the cockpit. Margaret finally allowed herself to lean back in her chair, exhausted but relieved. She had done something that many had thought impossible, saved a pilot's life by flying her aircraft from the ground. But as the celebration continued around her, Margaret knew that her quiet life in apartment 7B was over forever. She had revealed classified capabilities and her own identity to save one person's life. Now she would have to face the consequences of that decision. The medical team worked quickly to extract Captain Sarah Mitchell from the cockpit of the damaged F-22. Margaret watched the rescue operation on the command center monitors, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had successfully landed the aircraft, but Captain Mitchell's condition remained unknown. "Phoenix is responsive," came the report from the medical team leader. "Concussion protocol initiated, but she's conscious and talking." A cheer went up in the command center, and Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Captain Mitchell was going to survive. As the immediate crisis ended, Margaret became aware that several high-ranking officers were studying her with intense interest. Her successful remote landing had demonstrated capabilities that most people didn't know existed. Word was already spreading through military channels about the civilian who had appeared from nowhere to save, an Air Force pilot. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached Margaret's workstation with a serious expression. "Reaper, there are people who want to talk to you," he said quietly. "People from Washington. What you just did is going to raise a lot of questions about how you knew about classified systems." Margaret had expected this moment. Her knowledge of the remote guidance systems was supposed to be buried in classified files. By using that knowledge to save Captain Mitchell, she had revealed that she still possessed information that could be valuable to enemies of the United States. The Air Force would need to understand exactly what she knew and how she had maintained access to classified capabilities. "I understand," Margaret replied. "I knew this would happen when I made the decision to help. But I couldn't let Captain Mitchell die when I had the knowledge to save her." She looked around the command center one last time, knowing that her next destination would likely be a secure briefing room where she would face hours of questioning. Colonel Rodriguez approached with two men in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of intelligence officers. "Ms. Chen," the colonel said formally, "these gentlemen need to speak with you about today's events. They've assured me that you're not in any trouble, but there are security protocols that must be followed." Margaret nodded and gathered her personal belongings. As she prepared to leave the command center, she thought about Scout waiting for her in apartment 7B. The little dog would be confused when she didn't return that evening, and Mrs. Rodriguez would wonder where the quiet tenant had gone. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Margaret sat in a windowless room and answered questions about her background, her knowledge of classified systems, and how she had maintained her capabilities during 3 years of civilian life. The intelligence officers were thorough but respectful, clearly understanding that Margaret had used her knowledge for heroic purposes. "Ms. Chen," said the senior officer, a woman named Colonel Patricia Wells, "your actions today saved a pilot's life and potentially prevented civilian casualties if that aircraft had crashed in Denver. However, your continued possession of classified knowledge presents certain complications." Margaret had anticipated this conversation. "I never intended to use that knowledge again," she explained. "I kept the technical manuals because they were part of my military experience, but I had no plans to return to active duty. Today was an emergency situation that I couldn't ignore." The questioning revealed that Margaret's situation was more complex than anyone had realized. Her work on the remote guidance systems had been so classified that many current Air Force personnel didn't even know the capabilities existed. Margaret was one of only 5 people who fully understood the technology, and she was the only one not currently on active duty. As news of the successful rescue spread, Margaret found herself at the center of media attention she had never wanted. Television reporters were calling the remote landing a miracle of modern aviation technology, though they didn't understand the classified nature of what had actually happened. The Air Force Public Affairs Office was carefully managing the story to protect operational security. Captain Mitchell was released from the hospital the next day with a mild concussion and bruised ribs. One of her first requests was to meet the person who had saved her life. The meeting was arranged in a secure conference room at Peterson Air Force Base, away from media attention. "I don't remember much about the collision," Captain Mitchell told Margaret, "but I'm told you flew my aircraft better than I probably could have under those conditions. I owe you my life." The young pilot's gratitude was genuine and emotional, making Margaret feel that her decision to reveal herself had been worthwhile. The conversation between the 2 pilots revealed something unexpected. Captain Mitchell had heard stories about a legendary test pilot nicknamed Reaper, who had disappeared from active duty several years earlier. The stories described someone who could fly any aircraft under any conditions, someone who had trained the current generation of F-22 pilots in advanced techniques. "You're her, aren't you?" Captain Mitchell asked. "You're the Reaper that everyone talks about. The instructors at flight school used to tell stories about your missions, but they said you had retired." Margaret confirmed her identity, explaining that she had left the Air Force for personal reasons but had never stopped caring about the safety of fellow pilots. Meanwhile, back at Sunset Gardens apartment complex, Margaret's neighbors were beginning to realize that something unusual had happened to the quiet woman in 7B. Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed that Margaret hadn't returned home, and Scout was becoming increasingly agitated. Helen Burke from 7A had seen the news reports about the dramatic aircraft rescue and wondered if there was any connection to her. Mysterious neighbor, the intelligence officers, concluded their debriefing with an unexpected offer. "Ms. Chen," Colonel Wells said, "your skills are still valuable to the Air Force. We'd like to discuss the possibility of bringing you back on active duty, or at least as a civilian contractor. The remote guidance program needs someone with your expertise." Margaret requested time to consider the offer. Her quiet life in apartment 7B had been comfortable, but today's events had reminded her of the satisfaction she felt when using her skills to help others. She also realized that her secret was now impossible to maintain. Too many people knew who she really was, and returning to anonymity would be difficult if not impossible. That evening, Margaret was finally allowed to return to her apartment to check on Scout and gather some personal belongings. The little dog was overjoyed to see her, but Margaret knew that major changes were coming to both their lives. Margaret returned to apartment 7B late that evening to find Scout waiting anxiously by the door. The little dog jumped up on her legs, clearly relieved that his owner had returned. As Margaret looked around her simple apartment, everything seemed different now. The place that had been her refuge from the world now felt like a temporary stopping point rather than a permanent home. Her neighbors had definitely noticed her absence. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on the door within minutes of Margaret's return, expressing concern about Scout and asking if everything was all right. Margaret gave vague answers about a family emergency, but she could see the curiosity in the building manager's eyes. The next morning, Margaret found a note slipped under her door from Helen Burke in 7A. "Dear Margaret," it read, "I saw the news about that amazing aircraft rescue yesterday. The pilot they interviewed looked familiar, and I couldn't help but think about how you always seem different from the rest of us. If you need to talk to someone, I'm here." Helen had clearly connected the dots between her mysterious neighbor and the heroic pilot from the news reports. Margaret spent the morning making phone calls to arrange her affairs. If she accepted the Air Force's offer to return to active duty, she would need to terminate her lease and find a new home for Scout during deployment periods. The decisions felt overwhelming after 3 years of simple civilian routines. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called that afternoon with updates on both Captain Mitchell's recovery and the investigation into the aircraft collision. "Phoenix is doing well," he reported. "The collision was caused by a mechanical failure in the other aircraft, not pilot error. But more importantly, the brass wants to meet with you tomorrow about that job offer." The meeting took place in a conference room at Peterson Air Force Base with some of the highest-ranking officers Margaret had ever encountered. A general from Air Force Headquarters had flown in specifically to discuss Margaret's future with the service. The conversation was both an interview and a negotiation about how Margaret's unique skills could best serve the Air Force. "Ms. Chen," the general began, "yesterday's rescue demonstrated capabilities that could revolutionize how we handle aviation emergencies. But more than that, it showed that you've maintained skills and knowledge that make you invaluable to the Air Force. We'd like you to consider leading a new program that combines remote aircraft guidance with pilot training." The offer was more appealing than Margaret had expected. Instead of returning to regular flying duties, she would develop training programs for emergency situations and work with engineers to improve the remote guidance systems. It would be challenging work that used all of her experience while contributing to pilot safety across the entire Air Force. Margaret asked for details about where she would be stationed and what her responsibilities would include. The position would be based at Peterson Air Force Base, allowing her to stay in Colorado Springs. She would also be able to keep Scout, as the work would involve minimal travel and no overseas deployments. "There's one more thing," the general added. "Captain Mitchell has requested to be assigned to your program once she's cleared for full duty. She wants to learn the remote guidance techniques and help develop training protocols. It seems you've made quite an impression on her." That evening, Margaret walked Scout around the neighborhood while considering her options. The quiet life she had built in apartment 7B had been peaceful, but it had also been somewhat empty. Yesterday's rescue had reminded her of the satisfaction she felt when her skills made a real difference in people's lives. Margaret also thought about Captain Mitchell and the other young pilots who could benefit from advanced training in emergency procedures. Her knowledge of aircraft systems and remote guidance techniques could prevent future accidents and save lives. The opportunity to pass on her expertise to the next generation of pilots was appealing. The decision became clear when Margaret received a call from Captain Mitchell herself. "Ma'am," the young pilot said, "I wanted to thank you again for saving my life. But I also wanted to ask you something. Would you consider teaching other pilots the techniques you used? There are situations where remote guidance could save lives, and you're the only person who really understands how to make it work." Margaret was moved by the sincerity in Captain Mitchell's voice. The young pilot wasn't just grateful for being rescued. She was thinking about how to prevent similar situations for other aviators. It reminded Margaret of her own motivation when she had first joined the Air Force, the desire to serve something larger than herself. That night, Margaret sat at her computer and composed her acceptance letter to the Air Force. She would return to active duty and lead the development of advanced emergency response capabilities. It meant leaving the anonymity of Apartment 7B behind. But it also meant returning to work that gave her life meaning and purpose. Scout seemed to sense the changes were coming. The little dog stayed close to Margaret as she began packing her belongings and making arrangements to move. Mrs. Rodriguez was sad to learn that her quiet, reliable tenant would be leaving, though she still didn't fully understand what Margaret's real profession was. Helen Burke was more perceptive when Margaret stopped by to say goodbye. "I knew there was something special about you," the retired teacher said with a smile. "You had the bearing of someone who had done important things. I'm glad you're going back to whatever it was that made you who you are." As Margaret prepared for her final night in apartment 7B, she turned over all the photographs on her bookshelf. The images showed her in uniform, standing beside various aircraft, and receiving commendations for her service. She was no longer hiding from that part of her life. Tomorrow she would begin the process of returning to the Air Force and the work she had been meant to do. The quiet lady in 7B was about to become Colonel Margaret Reaper Chen once again, but this time she was ready to embrace both her past achievements and her future responsibilities. 6 months later, Colonel Margaret Chen stood in front of a classroom filled with the Air Force's most promising young pilots. The Advanced Emergency Response Training Center at Peterson Air Force Base had become one of the most sought-after assignments in the service, largely because of the revolutionary techniques being taught there. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, now fully recovered from her accident and serving as Margaret's assistant instructor. The bond between the two pilots had grown into a strong professional partnership, with Sarah helping to develop training scenarios based on real-world emergency situations. The remote guidance program had expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations. Margaret's techniques were now being taught to pilots across multiple air bases, and the technology was being adapted for use with different types of aircraft. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one pilot's life had evolved into a comprehensive program that was revolutionizing aviation safety. Today we're going to practice emergency communications protocols, Margaret announced to her class. These procedures could save your life or the life of another pilot someday. The students listened intently, knowing that their instructor had proven these techniques under the most extreme circumstances possible. The classroom walls were decorated with photographs from successful rescue operations that had used Margaret's methods. In the 6 months since the program began, remote guidance techniques had been used to safely land 3 damaged aircraft and guide numerous others through emergency situations. The quiet lady from apartment 7B had become one of the most respected officers in the Air Force. Margaret's personal life had changed dramatically as well. She now lived in base housing with Scout, who had become something of a mascot for the training center. The little dog often accompanied Margaret to her office, and the students enjoyed having him around during study sessions. Scout seemed to understand that his owner was doing important work again. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had been promoted and transferred to the Pentagon, where he briefed senior officials on the success of Margaret's program. The remote guidance capabilities were being integrated into Air Force doctrine, and other military services were requesting access to the training. Margaret's expertise was in demand around the world. The media attention had eventually died down, but Margaret occasionally received letters from aviation enthusiasts and young people interested in military careers. She tried to answer each one personally, encouraging others to pursue their dreams in aviation, while emphasizing the importance of safety and continuous learning. Captain Mitchell had proven to be an exceptional instructor, bringing her own perspective as someone who had been saved by the techniques she now taught. Her enthusiasm and detailed knowledge of emergency procedures made her popular with students, and she was being considered for her own command position. During a break between classes, Margaret walked outside and looked up at the clear Colorado sky. 22 Raptors were practicing formation flights overhead, their pilots now trained in the advanced emergency procedures that could save their lives if something went wrong. The sight filled Margaret with a sense of accomplishment that she had never felt during her quiet years in apartment 7B. Scout trotted beside her as they walked around the base. The little dog had adjusted well to military life, and he seemed to enjoy the attention from the young airmen and women who worked at the training center. Margaret often thought about how different their lives might have been if she had never heard that emergency radio call 6 months ago. Mrs. Rodriguez occasionally sent Margaret updates about the Sunset Gardens apartment complex. A new tenant had moved into 7B, a quiet young man who worked at a local tech company. The building manager always mentioned how much she missed Margaret's reliability and how the new tenant wasn't nearly as considerate. Helen Burke had visited Margaret at the base several times, fascinated by the transformation of her former neighbor. The retired teacher had become something of a celebrity in her own right, telling anyone who would listen about the mysterious woman who had lived next door and turned out to be a heroic pilot. As Margaret's first year back in the Air Force drew to a close, she received an unexpected honor, The Secretary of the Air Force announced that she would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for her role in saving Captain Mitchell and developing the emergency response program. The ceremony would be attended by pilots from around the world who had benefited from her training. The award citation read, "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight operations. Colonel Chen's innovative use of remote guidance technology to save the life of an unconscious pilot demonstrated exceptional skill, courage, and dedication to the safety of fellow aviators." Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her from the quiet anonymity of Apartment 7B to this moment of recognition. She had left the Air Force years earlier to escape painful memories and find peace in civilian life. But sometimes the skills and knowledge we try to leave behind are exactly what the world needs from us. Captain Mitchell approached as Margaret stood reading the award citation. "Ma'am," she said, "I wanted you to know that my little sister just got accepted to the Air Force Academy. She wants to be a pilot like both of us. I told her that the most important thing isn't flying the fastest or being the best in competition. The most important thing is being ready to help when someone needs you." Margaret smiled at her former student and current colleague. "That's exactly right, Sarah, and that's what we'll keep teaching here." As they walked back toward the training center, Margaret knew that her decision to emerge from Apartment 7B had been the right one. Sometimes hiding from our past means hiding from our purpose, and Margaret had found her purpose again in the most unexpected way. The quiet lady in 7B was gone forever. But Colonel Margaret Reaper Chen was exactly where she belonged, training the next generation of pilots and proving that heroism can emerge from the most ordinary places when courage meets opportunity.